It's great to see you again.
Good to see you, Allie. Welcome.
Thank you for having us here. You know, the premise that we're here under is that what you're building here is a sort of rebuilding of the conservative movement within the Republican Party. And I wonder what that looks like broadly.
Well, it's very humbling for me to see the way Advancing American Freedom has really emerged as the home of the conservative movement in Washington, D.C. But I'm proud of our team. I'm proud of the people that have joined us recently. But the work we've been doing is all an effort to wave the banner of strong national defense, limited government, free market economics, traditional values, including the right to life. And that's the agenda that drew me to the Republican Party as a young Democrat in my 20s. But more important than that, I think it's the movement that has defined the Republican Party over the last 50 years and resulted in a freer and more prosperous America.
I guess when I hear rebuilding, are those tenets that you're talking about missing right now?
Well, I think in some respects they are. Look, I and our whole team here at Advancing American Freedom are proud of what the new Trump administration has done, securing our border, making historic investments in our military, deploying our military, in Iran standing strongly with our cherished ally Israel. But there have been departures from the agenda that really defined the Trump-Pence years and has long defined the Republican Party, whether it be the stops and starts in support for our ally in Ukraine after the brutal invasion by Russia 4 years ago. And also on economic policy, Allie, we've seen some dramatic departures. Now, the president's broad-based tariffs against friend and foe alike, coming from a party that has always advocated free trade as a core principle, is a profound departure. But also seeing the nationalization of businesses, most recently the talk about taking a $500 million stake in Spirit Airlines, price controls on everything from pharmaceuticals to credit cards, and frankly marginalizing the right to life in our party. To see a Republican president appoint a pro-abortion secretary of HHS, and then to see HHS largely ignore the rapid expansion of mail-order abortion and mifepristone. I think it's been a disappointment to millions of pro-life Americans. And so while we're grateful for what the president has done in support of our national defense and securing our border, extending those Trump-Pence tax cuts from 8 years ago, those are the departures I think merit a fulsome debate, particularly as we look to the future of our movement and the future of the country.
I think given those things, they seem like pretty foundational fault lines. And so I was struck when I was preparing for this interview about the ways that you've said that President Trump hasn't changed the Republican Party all that much, because those things seem pretty big. Well,
let me be very clear on that point.
Please.
Presidents have every right to change the agenda of their parties, and President Trump won our party's nomination 3 different times. And in some respects, he has dramatically changed the Republican Party in terms of our approach to the economy, our approach to the wider world, and of course on those core values like the right to life. But what I believe in my heart is that he hasn't really changed the attitudes of the overwhelming majority of people that ever vote Republican. You know, one of the things about being a private citizen the last 5 years is traveling all across the country, even briefly during my campaign in 2023. I'm more convinced every day that the overwhelming majority of people that ever vote Republican, both Republican voters and independents and even some conservative Democrats, still cherish the principles of a strong national defense, pro-growth free market policies, limited government, traditional values, and that's what we champion here, and I truly do believe it still represents the future of the GOP.
I want to dig in on a few of these policy areas. We can start with abortion and the way that you feel that the pro-life movement has been sidelined, to borrow your word. Where do you want to see the administration focusing? And in an ideal world for the Republican Party, where would you see them focus that policy next?
Well, I couldn't be more proud to have been vice president in the most pro-life administration in American history. I mean, we took decisive steps to end taxpayer funding of abortion at home and abroad, but appointing 3 of the justices that gave the American people a new beginning for life, overturning Roe versus Wade, is something that I'll always cherish. But to see the Republican Party first in our party platform in 2024 literally eviscerate most of the historic language committing our party to the sanctity of human life was deeply disappointing. And I wrote about that, and we spoke about that from these offices as well. But to see the president appoint a pro-abortion secretary of HHS, and then to see that secretary, despite promises otherwise, to simply refuse to re-examine the impact of the abortion pill, mifepristone, that the Biden administration made available through as mail order abortion without physician visits and supervision. I think it's been deeply disappointing to us here, but also I think to millions of pro-life Americans who expect better from a Republican administration.
And I thought the interesting thing after the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe was there was this conversation that I had with many Republicans in the lead up to the 2024 election where they felt that the policy and the politics didn't quite match on this, in large part because 6 in 10 Americans do want abortion to be safe and legal. And Republicans, one of them, for example, described it to me as Republicans catching the car and then wondering if they might get run over by the politics of it.
Well, I hold the view that restoring the sanctity of life to the center of American law is the calling of our time. We have much to do to win hearts and minds across the country, but in overturning Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court of the United States returned that question to the states and to the American people. And I think the long history of the conservative movement at its very core has been defined by a commitment to the sanctity of life. And to see our party largely marginalize that, or suggest, as some have done, that it's now a state issue only, I think is a disappointment to millions of Americans. Look, I think we always have to speak with compassion about this issue. And we ought to urgently continue to support organizations that provide counseling and support to women facing crisis pregnancies. But the overwhelming majority of Americans for decades, regardless of their position on abortion, have opposed taxpayer funding of abortion. And it's one of the reasons why I was so pleased to see this Congress and this administration, at least for 1 year, end public funding for Planned Parenthood. But now we're coming up on the 4th of July on a deadline where literally in this election year we might see taxpayer funding of Planned Parenthood, the largest abortion provider in America, restored. And again, that what we're calling for here at Advancing American Freedom, I think, is what pro-life Americans are all calling for, and that is principled leadership for life, as well as for the broad conservative agenda that's always defined our party.
I also want to look at the way that you talk about the world stage, because certainly that has been where the administration's impact, I think, has been most felt in a way that has been surprising to some who've supported the president. You've talked about the isolationist streak that's manifesting at some parts of the conservative party, or of the Republican Party right now. But from Venezuela to Iran, potentially to Cuba,
right,
this administration has been active. And I wonder, you've said you weren't surprised when you saw that the president went into Iran, but a lot of his voters were. And I wonder whose view of his ideology is the most right.
Well, I couldn't be more proud of President Trump for making the decision to unleash the armed forces of the United States against the leading state sponsor of terror in Iran. I remain hopeful that the Iranians will come to the table and abandon their not only nuclear materials but nuclear ambitions and end decades of sowing terrorist violence across the region. But I'm very skeptical that that'll happen. I think the most important thing right now is that the president make it clear that we intend to finish the job.
But what does that even entail, right? I feel like the administration's been murky on what the actual goals of this are.
Well, there's an old saying that one doesn't make peace with one's enemy, one makes peace with one's defeated enemy. And the posture that I see from the Iranians doesn't suggest that they feel defeated right now. I think they largely are. I think our military has responded brilliantly in some 13,000 military strikes, but I think we may have to move forward with more military action to break their will. And look, at the end of the day, we literally have been at war for 47 years with the mullahs in Tehran. They've been sowing violence not just against Israel, but the IRGC and Qasem Soleimani, who our administration eliminated, were responsible for the deaths of more than 600 American service members in Iraq by any estimate. And through their support of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, Iran has been the greatest threat to peace and security in the region now for 5 decades. And I think it's absolutely essential now that we finish the job. And I know our military can secure the Strait of Hormuz. I know our military can create the conditions on the ground where the people of Iran can rise up and reclaim their future. And I think it's absolutely essential that the president and that all the voices in and around this administration make that clear.
There are some voices reportedly who were not on board initially with the action in Iran, among them your successor, Vice President J.D. Vance. When you criticize the more isolationist tendencies of some in the party, are you directing that at people like him?
Well, the President Trump I served with every day for 4 years is no isolationist. That's why I was disappointed when I saw the stops and starts of U.S. support for Ukraine. Look, Vladimir Putin launched a brutal and unprovoked invasion into Ukraine. And the people of Ukraine deserve the support of the United States and all of our allies across the West. I'm heartened they continue to get support from our European allies and that we're making military resources available.
But on that point on Ukraine, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when J.D. Vance was a senator, he was not pushing for more aid to Ukraine there either. And so I think that might be another instance. I'm wondering, are you directing your criticism at him?
Well, look, there have been institutions and individuals in Washington, D.C. that have been questioning America's role as leader of the free world. There are voices outside of government that have suggested in our movement that we have to make a choice between solving our problems here at home and being leader of the free world. I've always believed that's a pretty small view of the greatest nation on earth. For 75 years, we've done both of those things, and it just takes American leadership. But the thing I'm proudest about with regard to Iran is that the president, both this year and also with Operation Midnight Hammer, turned a deaf ear to those voices of isolationism and simply acted. Ukraine, I know, continues to be an ongoing question in the administration, but I truly do believe that weakness arouses evil. And that when America is strong and America is leading the free world is more secure and more stable. But then when we begin to question our role or say we don't have a unique role among free nations, I think that invites aggression, and we're going to continue to be a voice here for strong American leadership on the world stage.
It's interesting that you bring up the role of American leadership on the world stage, because the German chancellor back in February, and this is a quote from him, said the United States' claim to leadership has been challenged and possibly lost. He was citing comments at that point from the vice president and others in the Trump administration during the Munich Security Conference. Do you understand, based on some of the actions from the Trump administration and key figures within it, why that's the view?
Well, I certainly do. I mean, look, I've visited, as you know, Allie, I've visited Ukraine twice since the initiation of hostilities. And I think the military in Ukraine, President Zelensky, have responded with courage and innovation against the overwhelming force of the Russian military. And I truly do believe free nations in the world need to continue to give Ukraine what they need to defeat and repel that Russian invasion.
Is America giving that right now through the Trump administration?
I think that's an open question. I was disappointed to hear my successor recently boasting about the fact that we had ended support for Ukraine. Look, I have no doubt in my mind if Vladimir Putin overruns Ukraine, it's just a matter of time before the Russian military crosses a border that we're going to have to deal with him, with a NATO ally. But I also understand, the president's statements about NATO from time to time have undermined public confidence. But look, I know, having represented our country not only across Europe but around the world for 4 years, and in my years in Congress on the International Relations Committee, nations around the world know who the leader of the free world is. And in my experience, if America's not leading, the free world's not being led. And that's why I'm grateful for the President's leadership in Operation Epic Fury. Believe we need to see it through. We need to finish the fight diplomatically or militarily. But I hope that those same instincts that have led the President there will lead him to conclude that investing in our military, standing with our allies, standing up to our enemies is actually the American way.
I want to pick up just on 2 points there. When it comes to your successor, has he ever called you as the only other person who understands innately what it is to be Donald Trump's vice president?
We haven't ever spoken.
You've never spoken to the person who's the only other Trump vice president?
Look, people change their views. I remember the vice president was a pretty strong critic of our administration during our 4 years and showed up a lot more on your network than a lot of other Republicans.
And we welcome everyone.
I don't begrudge him that. I don't. People change their opinions, and he's changed his views. But I have to tell you, I really do believe that as people look to the future, and I understand, look, people are already in the midst of a midterm election. They're already thinking about the future, and many people look to the vice president and his family as a part of that conversation, as they did for me and my family during our time in office. And I understand and respect that. But I always remind people, I think when I see the cross currents in the Republican Party today, moving away from some traditional conservative principles that have always defined our party, when I look at 2028, I think it's going to be more important to focus on what we're for before we focus on who we're for.
It sounds like you're not looking at Vice President Pence in the midterms at all.
Well, what I'm looking at right now is the need to have a fulsome debate in the Republican Party over the next 2.5 years, because I really do believe not only are these conservative principles a pathway for success for the Republican Party, I think that over the last 50 years they've resulted in a more prosperous, more secure America. And but to see the Republican Party in many ways beginning to imitate the politics and policies of the Democratic Party, I think that's where our movement needs to return and to revive and in many ways rediscover the conservative principles that first came to national prominence with Ronald Reagan's election in 1980.
I want to just ask you one more thing that I saw. You know me, I'm a preparer. I was reading a lot of the things you've said recently. And back in September of last year, you said, "I'm very confident that someday soon we're going to have a government as good as our people again." And is that to say we don't have that right now?
Look, in all of my travels, I've spent a lot of time with people in the best of times, but also in the worst of times. You know, when the floodwaters rise, the wind blows and beats against the house, hurricanes, wildfires, tornadoes. You see the generosity of the American people, the resilience of the American people, but you also see the decency of the American people. You know, sometimes, Allie, I say, you get 15 miles out of Washington, D.C., the people in this country actually get along pretty well. They treat one another with respect in most instances, and I think the American people long for us to restore a threshold of civility to public life.
Because we don't have that right now?
I think in my time in and out of public office, there's been a coarsening of the public debate on both sides of the aisle. And I think the American people want to see us solve some of the intractable challenges that we face. Look, China's the greatest strategic and economic threat facing the United States in the 21st century. We're going to need to meet that moment with investments in our military and with economic reform. We have a national debt of $39 trillion that we're putting on our children and grandchildren. And it's going to take all of us working together to address that and to lift that burden. And as I said, now the leading cause of abortion in America is the abortion pill, which is going unrelated, unchecked. It's overrunning pro-life laws in some 30 states around the country with no action from this administration. But to deal with all of these issues, I think we've got to find a way to talk to one another, to listen to one another, and ultimately have government as good as our people again.
So I want to keep looking forward, but I also want to look at the present moment right now. And there's just a few issues in the news of day that I want to get you on. The first of them being the redistricting efforts that we've seen across the country, most recently Virginia passing new maps mid-cycle. But your home state of Indiana, Republicans there actually stood up to the White House and said, no, I'm not going to pass this. And now the White House is going after some of them, primary challenging them, threatening them in some ways. Is that the appropriate response?
Well, look, it's a free country. They say politics ain't beanbag, but I've been proud to support some of our state Senate candidates who are facing that onslaught today in Indiana. Look, all I know is what I read in the Constitution, and that is that the Constitution says time, place, and manner of elections is decided by state legislatures. The Congress has the ability to regulate elections to one degree or another, but my view, whether it was Virginia, whether it was in Indiana, is these things ought to be sorted out at the state level. But I think the American people also have now and have always bristled at the notion of drawing district lines for a particular outcome. I was disappointed to see the efforts in the state of Virginia, a state I think that our ticket got the better part of 45% of the vote, to see that they're ultimately, after this redistricting, going to end up with likely one Republican member of Congress. That doesn't feel like representative democracy to most people, and the time may come for Congress to use its authority and to limit redistricting to every 10 years after the census. They have the authority to do that.
Yeah.
They've considered it, but after all the redistricting battles mid-decade that have taken place, it may be an idea whose time has come.
Would you have supported it if you were still governor of Indiana?
Well, I think I would have supported the legislature sorting it out. I'll tell you, before I was governor, when I was a member of Congress, and when I was governor, I didn't involve myself in districting issues for state legislative candidates. But yeah, my one deep conviction was that whatever Indiana was to decide, it should be decided by Hoosiers and by state legislators. And they ultimately sorted it out. And as I said, I've become involved in at least one of those races this May, and we'll see how it sorts out.
You know, the other thing that I've heard you say time and again over the last 10 years is that you are a Christian, conservative, and Republican in that order. And so to that end, I want to get your reaction to President Trump's recent criticism of Pope Leo and this larger theme of provocations against the church and faith communities. You know, what did it feel like to wake up on Easter morning and see that post from the president where he mockingly said, "Praise be to Allah"? He's in a protracted battle, war of words with the Pope right now. And of course, then that AI image of Trump as Jesus Christ.
Well, I found the language and the images offensive. I think the president was right to take one image down. His ongoing argument with Pope Leo, I think, has abated to a degree, and I welcome that. I think the Pope has every right to express himself in a manner that he believes is consistent with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and The president has every right to express his view and his agenda for the American people. And I think if I was advising him as I did every day for 4.5 years, I'd say, let the Pope be the Pope and you be the president.
Have you called him on this or anything else, speaking of advising him?
I have not. The president, I was able to congratulate the president on his election and congratulate the First Lady, but we don't talk as often as we used to, but I get the distinct impression he still listens to us and watches what we do, because I think he knows, as he knew for 4.5 years, that I mean what I say when it comes to conservative principles and values. I mean, I was a Democrat as a young man and started to listen to the voice and the values and the optimism of President Ronald Reagan, and that's what drew me to the Republican Party. By the time I got to Congress, I ended up finding myself battling against a lot of the big spenders in my own party. I opposed the Wall Street bailout. I opposed No Child Left Behind and other big government programs, even by a Republican president. But we got it turned around. We got our party back focused on those principles. And I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration that I believe was a conservative record. Pro-growth tax policies, rebuild our military, conservatives on our courts, free market principles. But I see us going back into a similar time that I experienced when I was in Congress now, where our party is drifting away from those principles that have always defined the conservative movement and been at the center of our party. And that's my calling now, is to simply be a consistent voice for the very principles and values that drew me to the Republican Party, and frankly have drawn tens of millions of Americans to our movement over the decades.
Can I also ask you about a recent Department of Justice move to try to throw out some of the most serious charges after January 6th, the seditious conspiracy charges? I know you were critical of the initial moves from the Trump administration for the rioters broadly, but this goes a step further.
My opinion hasn't changed from the afternoon of January 6th. And that is that anyone that perpetrated violence against law enforcement or vandalized the Capitol should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And I have, look, were there people who wandered into the building that day, never assaulted a police officer, got caught up? I had no problem with people being pardoned who had engaged in no violence, but anyone who assaulted a police officer, anyone who was involved in a conspiracy to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power that day, I believe should be held to the strictest account of the law.
So let's come back to the future, because we're having this conversation today as some pretty key figures that have bolstered the MAGA movement, talking Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're out there right now saying, I regret it, I'm sorry, it's not what I thought it was. Marjorie Taylor Greene has left Congress. They're voicing regrets, and it feels like MAGA is fracturing. So what takes its place?
Well, I really do believe the Republican Party is now and has always been a conservative party. I mean, I spoke in front of more Trump rallies than I can remember.
I went to more Trump rallies than I can remember.
But I talked about our conservative agenda. I talked about rebuilding our military, about cutting taxes and regulations, unleashing the American economy, about the right to life and traditional values. And those small crowds that I drew and the large crowds that he drew thundered in applause. I've never really seen a distinction between people drawn to the conservative movement and the overwhelming majority of people who identify as part of the MAGA movement. They're all the same Americans, with some exceptions. Now,
that's so. Do you consider yourself MAGA then, by that?
Well, I was proud to be a part of a movement to make America great again, but I'm a conservative, and always have been a conservative. And I think people that have tried to break the Republican Party into pieces don't fully appreciate the literally hundreds of thousands of people that I have personally interacted with over the years. I mean, this is in many respects simply a conservative party, and I think the Tea Party movement that predated the election of the Trump-Pence ticket and the rise of the MAGA movement were all animated, Allie, by the same principles, and those are a strong defense, limited government, traditional values. As I said, the president's changed that agenda to one extent. I saw him, not surprisingly, not long ago say that he was MAGA. He'll decide what MAGA is, and to a certain extent he's right, but I still do believe the overwhelming majority of people in our movement cherish those conservative principles, and I want to continue to be a voice for that.
I feel like you're speaking to conservatives' better angels here. It does feel like there's an inflection point coming for the party because we're about to be post-Trump. But do you consider what would happen if the party goes the other way, veers in the direction of isolationism that you're talking about, or even this pretty steady stream of anti-Semitism among some of the younger people who feel welcomed into this party?
Well, there's no place in America for anti-Semitism in any form, in any way, and it must be universally condemned. And we've done that here, and we'll continue to call that out. I couldn't be more proud of the fact that I was part of a rising generation of Republicans 25 years ago that really brought our party into the fold to understand the vital importance of U.S.-Israel relationship. I mean, traditionally it had been the Democratic Party that had provided the bulwark of support for Israel. Many Republicans did, but we, with a lot of help, were part of a movement within the party that virtually, laid an impregnable foundation for support for Israel. But now, we've seen the rise of anti-Semitic rhetoric on the Democrat progressive left and even on the populist right. And so now more than ever, I think we've got to make it clear that America stands with Israel, and there will be no tolerance for anyone in the public debate for anti-Semitism in any form.
I know you've said that you're not a long-term planner, but I listened to you here, and this idea of pushing for a debate leading up to 2028, of the vision that you clearly have for the Republican Party. And you sound like someone who's at least thinking about what it would look like to run for president again.
Well, I don't know quite what it sounds like. I will tell you the calling of my life right now is to champion these principles.
But do you do that as a candidate? It's a pretty big podium.
I've written an entire book that's coming out entitled What Conservatives Believe, because I think, as I said before, I think this is a season where people in our movement need to focus on what we're for before we focus on who we're for. We have a very deep bench in the Republican Party, lots of great talent, and I have no plans to re-enter the political arena, but I do have plans to continue to be an unwavering voice for the conservative values that have defined this party and so well served our nation over the last 50 years. My concern is if the Republican Party continues to embrace the kind of isolationism that many Democrats have advocated over the years, if we embrace policies of tariffs and protectionism that Democrats have embraced over the years, if we walk away from championing values, if we embrace big government intervention into our economy and abandon free market principles, we'll become an echo of the Democratic Party. And as Ronald Reagan said memorably in 1976, we need to paint in bold colors, not pastels. We need to offer the American people a choice, not an echo. And I think by returning our party and our movement to those time-tested conservative principles that have defined the Republican Party for 5 decades, we'll offer the American people a choice, and I like our chances.